All right, so now it's time to talk about Hollywood and China. As you can see on the screen there, we've got the Hollywood sign and then a Chinese equivalent. It's it's I think it's pronounced Qingdao or Qingdao. I'm not gonna pretend to know how to pronounce that. But there's basically a lot of studios in China now producing movies, and that's one of them. They've got their backlot there, and they put up a nice sign that's Hollywood-esque. But the relationship between Hollywood and China is ever more complex and intertwined. And recently, the Batman, which is coming out in a few days, and we're going to talk all about it in a future episode. It got a release in China, which is the first superhero movie in a long time to do that, because it seems like in the majority, if not all, of 2021 last year, most Marvel movies weren't allowed to play there, and most other Hollywood movies weren't allowed to play there. Uncharted, with Tom Holland, Mark Wahlberg, which is currently playing everywhere else, is also getting a release in China. So it looks like Chinese movies are flowing back into, Hollywood movies are flowing back into China, I should say. So the question becomes, how important is the Chinese market for Hollywood films? I'll let you guys take it from there. Andrew, what do you
Sure. Well, it's interesting because for the last 10, 15 years, China's been this rising power, and we've been seeing a lot of emphasis placed on how do we as Americans either appeal to the Chinese market, or how do we react to the Chinese content that comes our way? And so there's been this back and forth, especially as we've developed our own streaming platforms, they've been developing their own streaming platforms, and for some reason there really is this clamor to get into China if you're an American studio, because there's a lot of money in the Chinese audiences. There's a lot of people there. They watch our movies. They enjoy what they see. But what is it? Why is there such demand for entry into the Chinese market for films? That's what I wanted to start with today.
Well, I mean, I can answer that very quickly. It's the Chinese box office is now the number one box office in the world. As you can see on the screen there, I've got a story from IndieWire. This is from 2018, and that's really where the first signs of it began, where in the first quarter of the year, the Chinese box office overtook the North American box office, which historically has been the biggest one. So, at the end of the day, it's a bit Hollywood, it's a not show friends, it's show business, as, the great Dusty Rhodes might say, the late great Dusty Rhodes. So the Chinese box office is bigger now than North America, so it plays a big part financially. So I think that's why Hollywood,
right. But what I'm saying is there's a limit on what can actually get made and what gets produced and released in China. Mags, what were you going to say?
So it's called Beijing Center, essentially. So they choose 34 films every year, 34 international films. Sometimes there's a couple extra. That's why, first of all, it's an oddly specific number, but 34 films that are being picked to be shown in the cinemas in China, and not everyone gets the cut, makes a cut, as you can imagine, because we have way too many films coming out each year. But Beijing Center determines release dates for films. So just because the film is coming out in US at the certain time, it doesn't mean it will come out at the same time in China. The perfect example would be when China celebrated their 100th anniversary of the Communist Party founding. There was no films shown for 2 months. So all the releases were pushed by months, not days, not weeks, months. They also determine how much advertising there's going to be, which cinemas they're going to show the films in. There's a lot that goes into planning and approving film to land in China.
From what I understand, it actually used to be 10, and the people who negotiated the deal was actually then Vice President Biden and then Vice President Xi Jinping. And that forward-looking, projection into like these are the business decisions that matter. this is the audience that matters. And what we've seen is people potentially changing the way they make the movies, or trying to appeal to Chinese. Roland, here's a question for you. Are we making movies that appeal to Chinese audiences or Chinese censors?
That is a really good question. I was doing some research for this, and I found this interview from this Dan Mintz, who is the chief executive of DMG Entertainment, which is the Chinese partner for Iron Man 3. And he had this really good quote, which is, back home in the States, you were talking to just one person, the consumer. Here, you were talking to two. One is the government, and the other is the consumer. They have a lot of... It's no surprise that China and U.S. have very different cultural values. Mm-hmm. Like in America, we like a hero that is very independent. He likes to have a fall. He chooses greatness. Yeah. But in China, actually, it's greatness is thrusted upon them. They're pretty stable throughout. I've weirdly found out, and it's more of a collective thing, and they'll even rewrite scripts, like central themes, so that they'll make sure that they're hitting these marks.
Yeah, I mean, in other cultural differences that I've seen between American audiences and Chinese audiences is, we comedies will do well here. They'll perform well here. Mm-hmm. Most of the American movies that do well in China are action movies, and it's not like action, like you say, rising up against power. It's mindless action. It's Transformers. Yeah. It's Venom. It's, and these are actually Furious. Fast and Furious, where it's like there's nothing political about it. It's always just action happening, and that's impressive. But there is, sometimes that falls on deaf ears in America. Mm-hmm. Do you see a problem with audiences in America or with studios in America not making movies for Americans?
100%. So, I mean, a very interesting part to that would be adding what happened with Chloe Zhao and Nomadland, right?
Sure.
You guys heard, there was the interview that aired where, years before her winning an Oscar for Nomadland, she essentially called China a country where there are lies everywhere, and Nomadland got to be cancelled everywhere in China. They deleted any social media which were celebrating her winning, and she then she didn't release, that's the point. She got to direct Eternals, and they didn't get Chinese release in China.
So I'd read about Eternals and that whole thing, and this was something where they added characters that were gay, and this is another thing that in China
it's a big no-go.
Yeah, and so they knew from the outset that was never going to make it to the Chinese box office. They knew that it was based on the fact that she was directing and all of these other things that they put in the movie. It was never going to make it to China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And and that's again part of the culture right now. China's sort of doing this war on sissy men and saying, like, we're not going to tolerate anything that encourages the effeminate behavior of men. So K-pop has sort of been ousted.
Yeah.
And,
China is a very traditional place. Like, they put a lot of, they make their history very sacred, and they want to kind of keep to that as much as possible. While that's another cultural thing. A lot of times, American movies are looking to the future instead.
Yeah.
So that's something. It's completely a no-go.
Yeah, like we're trying to be innovative and yeah.
Yep. Any time travel narratives, like Back to the Future was banned. Anything that suggests ability to alter reality. However, in 2012, I found out that Looper which has scenes in Shanghai with dialogue depicting China as representation of the future, they didn't care. It made past censor.
Huh.
So
Yeah, well,
there
Although
is a fluke.
I'd heard for Looper originally in the script, one of the characters said, he went to France in the future, and they actually rewrote that scene to say, "I'm from the future, go to China," and
Wow.
that because it characterizes China as a rising power, that was acceptable.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to look at here, is that as we've been trying to break into their market, companies in China like Tencent and Alibaba, they've actually started creating their own production companies which make American movies. And so something like Venom was actually a Tencent production. And now we're at a point where Chinese money is actually going into producing American movies that will do better in China. It's almost an insider trading kind of thing. Dan, you kind of know about the numbers of this stuff. What do you see going on here?
Yeah, I mean, insider trade. I mean, look, I'll be completely honest with you. Insider trading isn't really a concept that I am too familiar with, but so that analogy is not necessarily something that I would use. But yeah, I mean, there's an increasing amount of Hollywood productions, and it's not just movies. It's TV shows. It's even going beyond movies and TV shows, like the kind of things you would think as a TV show. Like they do reality television, they do scripted dramas, they do movies of all kinds of different genres, but they generally tend to focus on specific genres. Like they, for example, here's a great example, right? So I pulled up the Wikipedia page of Legendary Entertainment.
Yeah.
And Legendary Entertainment from 2000 to 2016 was independently owned. It started out by Thomas Tull, who founded the company. And then in 2016, Wanda Group, which is a Chinese conglomerate, sort of like a Samsung, if you will, they took over Legendary. And then since then, they've largely invested in movies that tend to be in genres that Chinese audiences tend to love and flock to. So genres would include things like sci-fi and big monster movies. So like one of the big series of movies that Legendary's invested in over the years since 2016 is the Godzilla franchise. So like the Godzilla movies, you have the King Kong movies, like all of those movies are financed almost entirely by Legendary. They're distributed by Warner Brothers and like whatever other company, Universal. But they have an increasing amount of presence. So the question that I'm going to ask you guys is, and then I think this is already true to a certain degree, usually in film production, if you're putting up the money, you have some level of sway over the creative side of production.
Absolutely.
Especially in Hollywood movies, which is they're not like not every Hollywood big budget tentpole is an auteur's venture, if you will. It's not like somebody like the director owns every part of it. It's usually like a corporate conglomerate story that's being told where there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So naturally, I think Chinese financiers have a lot of influence. What do you guys think about that? Like the creativity side of things.
I mean, they changed the structure. Oh, sorry, Mags, you were going to say something.
No. Change the structure. Yeah.
I was going to say, like, they've been known to even change the structure of how a movie is made. Like, in America, we have a 3-act structure, which is setup, confrontation, and then resolution. And they have something called Qi Chen Xuan Jia, which basically means setup, development, redirection, and conclusion. Like they make a really big deal about like, hey, let's add a little flavor, let's add a little twist, just changing the whole rising climax and all these things.
That was a really good pronunciation, by the way.
I wrote it down. I tried to make sure I had that. Thank you, Max. What were you gonna say?
I was just, I mean, have you heard about Quentin Tarantino and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
A little bit.
So there was a Bruce Lee scene. Do you guys remember?
Yeah. Yes.
So that's the instance where because you talked about when the filmmakers actually agreed to change parts of the film, where being Quentin, was like, no, screw you guys. And he pushed back because he was like, I am going to depict it the way I want it to be. Despite the film having co-producers who were Chinese investors. It started with his Bruce's Lee daughter complaining about an unkind portrayal of Bruce Lee, who's like a national hero for China, and Sony, which was obviously the studio that did Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah.
They backed him up, Quentin Tarantino, completely aware of losing, a lot of the money, but they showed that they actually don't care what they want it to be shown.
Yeah, so that's the question that I really wanted to pose to you guys and to anybody watching here is, when we get into this mess of, not even you could call it a mess. When we get into this mess of money intermingling and creative control and trying to play to censors' tastes and to other audiences' tastes, well, we find that like American media tends to be a little more homogenous because they're trying to appeal to everybody. Dan Harmon will frequently say that like television kind of reeks of compromise, and so artistic vision is always, diluted into being something that is just, the slight flavor of what was the original intention. And so when we look at media, when we look at Chinese movies, American movies, or movies that are funded by both countries, who is influencing who? Is this American culture going into China, if they're changing it? Or is the control of the China censorship affecting how we make movies? Is that affecting the culture in America? Because movies are culture in America. Tell us what you think in the comments. Maybe we'll talk about it again some other time.